The subway station was quiet that night, the kind of quiet that only came in the late hours. The clerk, named Tom, had been working the night shift at the station for a few months now. He was used to the silence that came with it. Most of the time, it was just him, his thoughts, and the occasional passenger who would rush by to catch a train or make a quick phone call. There was a certain peace about it. No loud noises or crowded spaces, just the low hum of the trains in the background. Tom had grown used to it, even finding comfort in the solitude. He stood behind the small counter, glancing at the clock on the wall. It was already past midnight. Not much happened at this hour. The city outside was quiet too, most people in their homes, resting for the next day. Tom sipped his coffee, staring out into the empty platform, his mind wandering. He had always wondered what it would be like to work in a place where nothing ever really happened. It was easy to zone out, to get lost in the stillness. The fluorescent lights above hummed quietly, and the sound of the trains passing on the tracks outside was distant and familiar. He thought about calling it a night soon. The shift had been long, and he was starting to feel the weight of the hours. But just as he was about to turn away from the counter, he heard something, faint but distinct, a soft sound. At first, he thought it was just the usual creaks and groans of the old station. However, the sound grew louder, clearer. It was a faint cry, almost like the sound of a baby. Tom's heart skipped a beat. He looked around, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. The station was almost empty, save for a few people here and there, heading to their trains or waiting for a ride. He stood up from behind the counter and moved cautiously toward the back area of the station, where the public bathrooms were located. He wasn't sure what was happening, but there was something about the sound that made him uneasy. He had worked here for a while, but nothing like this had ever happened before. The cry echoed through the empty station, a pitiful sound that made Tom's footsteps quicken. He reached the door to the bathroom and hesitated for a moment. It was unusual for someone to be in there at this time of night, especially with the sound of crying. As he pushed the door open, his eyes quickly scanned the room. The bathroom was dimly lit, the walls covered in the usual grime from years of use. And there, in the corner, sitting on the cold floor, was a young girl. She was hunched over, her arms wrapped protectively around something in her lap. Tom's breath caught in his throat as he took a few cautious steps closer. At first, the girl didn't move, her face hidden by the messy hair that hung in front of her. The baby's cries were growing louder now, and Tom felt a wave of confusion and concern wash over him. He had seen a lot during his shifts. Drunk passengers, lost bags, a few fights here and there. But this was different. He couldn't understand what was happening, but he knew something wasn't right. He took another step forward, his voice breaking the silence. "Are you okay? Can I help you?" The girl finally looked up at him, and Tom was taken aback by the fear in her eyes. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with panic. She didn't speak, but her expression said everything. It was as though she was caught between wanting help and being too afraid to trust anyone. She didn't say a word, but the way she held the baby to her chest made it clear how desperately she was trying to protect it. Tom could feel his heart racing. This was no ordinary situation. There was something about the way the girl looked that made his stomach twist with unease. He had no idea what was going on, but one thing was certain. This was not the kind of night he had expected. Tom's heart raced as he stood there, unsure of what to do. The girl was still holding the baby tightly, her arms wrapped around it like she was afraid someone would try to take it away. The crying continued, sharp and urgent, echoing through the empty bathroom. Tom couldn't just leave her there. He had to do something, but he wasn't sure what. He stepped closer, trying to keep his voice calm. "It's okay. I'm here to help," he said softly. But the girl didn't respond. She just stared at him, her eyes wide with fear. There was something unsettling about the way she looked at him, like she didn't trust anyone. Tom knew it wasn't her fault. Something had happened to her, something that made her scared to talk to anyone, to trust anyone. Tom's mind raced. He thought about calling the police, but he didn't want to scare her even more. What if she ran? What if she panicked and did something that would hurt herself or the baby? He had to find a way to get her to open up, to at least tell him what was going on. He crouched down a few feet away from her, trying to make himself seem less threatening. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said gently, keeping his distance. "I just want to help." For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of the baby's cries. Then, slowly, the girl shifted slightly. She looked at Tom for a second before glancing down at the baby in her arms, almost like she was trying to decide what to do. She seemed to be calculating something in her mind, unsure of whether she could trust him. Tom didn't push her. He just waited, letting the silence stretch between them. Finally, the girl spoke, her voice barely a whisper. I don't know where to go," she said, her words shaky. "I don't have anywhere to go." Tom's chest tightened with concern. He wanted to reach out, to comfort her, but he knew he had to be careful. "You're not alone," he said, keeping his voice steady. "We'll get you the help you need." He was trying to reassure her, but a part of him wasn't sure what kind of help she needed or how he could provide it. The girl's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away, as if ashamed of them. "I don't want anyone to know," she whispered. "I don't want anyone to take him." Tom felt a chill run through him. The desperation in her voice, the way she clutched the baby like it was the only thing in the world keeping her from falling apart. It was clear now that she was in serious trouble. There was more to this than just a scared young girl with a baby. Something had happened, something that made her afraid of people finding out. He couldn't imagine what she had been through, but Tom knew he couldn't leave her there. "No one's going to take him," he said firmly, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "I promise." The girl didn't respond right away. She just looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to trust him. Tom didn't know how to make her feel safe, but he hoped his words were enough. The baby's cries seemed to soften slightly, and for a brief second, Tom thought the girl might relax. But then she tensed up again, looking toward the door as if expecting someone to come in. Tom followed her gaze, but the station remained quiet. No one else was around. He could see the fear in her eyes, the way her body was tense, ready to run at the slightest movement. Tom took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. He needed to get her out of the bathroom, out of the danger that she seemed to be hiding from. But how could he help her if she wasn't ready to trust him? How could he convince her that she was safe? He knew he couldn't force her to talk, but he had to find a way to keep her there until help arrived. Tom slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He didn't want to make her feel trapped, but he needed to call someone. Someone who could help. "I'm going to call someone who can help," he said gently, looking into her eyes. "But I need you to trust me. You're not alone anymore." Tom's hands were trembling slightly as he held up his phone, ready to dial for help. He kept his eyes on the girl, who hadn't moved from her position on the bathroom floor, still clutching her baby tightly. The baby had stopped crying for a moment, almost as if sensing the tension in the room. The silence felt heavy, but Tom knew it was the right time to act. The girl needed help. He couldn't let her stay here, alone and vulnerable. He dialed the number for the police, his mind racing. As he waited for the line to connect, he glanced at the girl again, hoping she wouldn't bolt before the authorities could arrive. Her eyes were filled with fear, but they also held something else, a deep sadness, as though she had been through something far beyond what anyone her age should ever experience. When the operator answered, Tom's voice was steady but filled with urgency. "Hello, I need help," he said. "I found a young girl in the subway station bathroom, and she's with a newborn baby. She's scared and won't speak much. I think she needs immediate medical attention and someone to help her." The operator responded quickly, asking for more details and reassuring Tom that help was on the way. Tom felt a small sense of relief. He wasn't alone in this anymore, but he didn't want to leave the girl alone, even for a moment. He turned his attention back to her, trying his best to comfort her without overwhelming her. "They're coming, okay? Help is on the way," he said gently, though he wasn't sure if she could even hear him. The girl still didn't say anything. She just looked at him with those wide, fearful eyes, but there was something different in the way she was looking at him now. It was as if she was starting to realize that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't entirely alone in this world. Tom could feel the weight of her gaze, the silent question of whether he was someone she could trust. He didn't know what she had been through, but he knew it had to be something unimaginable. No one should have to face what she was going through. No one should be left in a bathroom, scared and alone, with a newborn baby to care for. The thought of what she might have been running from made Tom feel sick to his stomach. As he stood there, he found himself wondering about the girl's past. Who was she? Where did she come from? Why was she here, in the subway station, in such a terrible situation? But no matter how many questions he had, he knew that right now, what mattered most was getting her the help she needed. The baby stirred in her arms again, letting out another soft cry. Tom could see the girl's face soften, and for the first time since he had found her, he saw a small flicker of something that resembled hope. She gently rocked the baby in her arms, trying to soothe it. Tom felt a pang of empathy for her. She was just a girl, holding her baby, trying to survive in a world that seemed determined to break her. "Everything's going to be okay," Tom said quietly, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. But he had to try, for her and for the baby. He couldn't fix everything, but he could help her take the first step toward safety. As he hung up the phone, he stepped a little closer to her, but he kept a respectful distance. He wanted to offer some kind of comfort, but he didn't want to make her feel cornered. The girl's gaze flickered from him to the bathroom door, then back to her baby. She seemed to be lost in thought, still processing everything that had happened. Tom knew that even after the authorities arrived, this would be just the beginning of the girl's journey. She would have to face so much more: medical checks, questioning, and most likely, an investigation into her past. But for now, he was all she had. And for the first time in a long while, Tom realized that sometimes being there for someone, just being present, was all that mattered. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, signaling the arrival of help. Tom looked toward the door, relief flooding through him. He could finally let go of the weight of responsibility, knowing that the girl would be in good hands. But before the door swung open, the girl glanced up at him again, her eyes filled with silent gratitude. It was a brief moment, but it was enough to remind Tom why he had acted in the first place: to offer hope when all seemed lost. As the sound of footsteps grew louder, signaling that help was on the way, Tom stood still, watching the girl closely. She hadn't moved much since he had dialed for assistance. She was still sitting on the cold floor, cradling the baby against her chest, but her eyes were now fixed on the door. There was something tense about the way she was watching it, as if she expected someone to burst through at any moment. It made Tom's stomach tighten. He could feel her fear, her anticipation. He wished there was more he could do for her in this moment, but he had already done everything he could think of. He stepped a little closer to her, but not too close. He didn't want to overwhelm her. "Help is almost here," he said softly, trying to reassure her, though his own voice trembled slightly. She didn't respond, but her gaze didn't leave the door. It was clear that, despite the promise of help, she was still unsure, still uncertain if she could trust the people who were coming. Tom couldn't blame her. He didn't know what had brought her to this point, but he could tell from the way she was acting that she had been through something terrible. Her silence spoke volumes about the kind of fear and trauma she had experienced. She wasn't just a scared young girl. She was a person who had learned to guard herself from the world, to shut others out for fear of what might happen if she didn't. Tom knew that earning her trust wasn't going to be easy. The baby stirred again in her arms, its cries more insistent now. Tom watched as the girl shifted, rocking it gently, trying to soothe it in the only way she knew how. The baby's cries were sharp, but there was something heartbreaking about them. Small, desperate, and full of the kind of need only a mother could understand. Tom couldn't help but feel a deep sense of sympathy for both of them. The girl was doing her best, but she was barely more than a child herself. She was fighting a battle she hadn't asked for, and she had no one to help her, until now. As he looked at her, Tom's mind wandered briefly to what could have happened to bring her here, alone in this bathroom in the subway station, with nothing but her baby for company. He wanted to know everything, but he also understood that now wasn't the time to ask. When the authorities arrived, they would have the chance to ask the questions and get the answers. His role right now was simple: to keep her safe, to be there for her in this moment of crisis. That was all he could do. A small part of Tom's mind wandered to the baby again. He could see how fragile it was, how small and vulnerable. He wondered what kind of life the baby would have, and whether the girl would ever feel safe enough to raise it without fear. It was a thought that weighed heavily on him. But for now, he focused on the girl, on trying to help her find some sense of comfort while they waited for the help to arrive. Then, finally, the door to the bathroom creaked open, and two uniformed officers stepped inside. The girl's body tensed immediately, her eyes widening with fear. She looked at Tom for reassurance, but he could see the panic rising in her. The officers, both calm and composed, stopped just inside the doorway. They didn't approach her right away. Instead, they gave her space, understanding that she needed to process what was happening. One officer spoke gently, trying to ease the tension. "We're here to help," she said in a soft, reassuring tone. "You're not in trouble. We're here to keep you and your baby safe." The girl didn't answer, but Tom could see the slight shift in her posture. She was still scared, but she wasn't as rigid as before. The officers didn't press her for information. They gave her time, allowing her to decide when she was ready to talk. Tom stepped back, giving the girl and the officers the space they needed. He wasn't sure if the girl would ever open up fully, but for the first time since he had found her, he felt a sense of hope. The girl wasn't alone anymore. And maybe, just maybe, this was the first step toward a better life for her and her baby. As the officers began to gently speak to the girl, Tom stood off to the side, watching them. He couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and uncertainty. He had done what he could, but now it was in the hands of the professionals. The girl was still holding her baby tightly, but her posture had softened slightly. She didn't appear as tense as she had when the officers first entered, though her eyes still darted around the room, as if she was expecting someone to burst in or something terrible to happen at any moment. The officer who had spoken earlier crouched down a little, trying to bring herself to the girl's level. She spoke in calm, reassuring tones. "We're here to make sure you and your baby are safe. No one is going to hurt you." Her voice was gentle, like a mother trying to soothe a frightened child. The other officer stood quietly behind her, giving the girl space, not rushing her, letting her process what was happening. Tom could see how much effort it took for the girl to respond. Her mouth opened slightly, but the words didn't come out at first. It was as if she wanted to speak but couldn't find the right words or the courage to say them. Her grip on her baby tightened again, as though she was trying to protect the little one from something, though no one in the room posed a threat. After a long pause, the girl spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know where to go. I don't have anywhere." Her words trailed off, the fear in her voice unmistakable. Tom could hear the hopelessness in her tone. She wasn't just scared for herself, but for her baby too. It was clear that she didn't know what her next step was, where she would go after this. She was lost, both physically and emotionally. The officer who had been speaking nodded gently, showing understanding. "It's okay," she said. "You don't have to know everything right now. We're here to help you. We'll make sure you and your baby are taken care of." The officer's words seemed to have a calming effect on the girl, but she still looked uncertain, as though she wasn't sure whether she could trust them or if help would actually come through for her. Tom felt a pang of sympathy for the girl. He could only imagine how difficult it must be for her to trust anyone after what she had likely been through. He didn't know the full extent of her story, but the look on her face, the way she clutched her baby, told him that it had been bad. Very bad. He had seen people in tough situations before, but this felt different. There was a sadness about her that went beyond just being scared. It was a deep-rooted sadness that had built up over time. The officers continued to speak with the girl, but Tom knew that even though the authorities were here now, things wouldn't be resolved easily. The girl would need time. Time to heal, time to feel safe again, time to trust. And there was no quick fix for that. Tom could only hope that with the right support, she would start to feel like she wasn't alone, that there were people out there who cared about her and her baby. He thought about the baby again, the small infant in her arms. It had stopped crying, and now it seemed to be just watching the scene unfold. Tom couldn't help but wonder what kind of future this baby would have. Would it grow up in a world where its mother had a chance to heal, to build a life for them both? Or would it be forever marked by the fear and uncertainty that had gripped its young mother? Tom was pulled from his thoughts when he heard the girl speak again. This time, her voice was a little clearer, though still shaky. "I don't want anyone to take him. Please don't let anyone take him," she pleaded, her eyes wide with panic again. She was back to her protective stance, fear creeping back into her eyes. She was afraid that the moment she let go, her baby would be taken from her, as if she had no right to keep it. The officer gave a reassuring smile, leaning in slightly. "You're not going to lose your baby," she said firmly. "We're here to make sure you both are safe, and we'll help you figure out what's next." Tom watched as the girl slowly, almost imperceptibly, relaxed. The fear didn't leave her completely, but there was a shift in her body, a small sign that maybe, just maybe, she could start to trust these people, at least a little. For Tom, it was clear that this wasn't just about getting the girl medical help or finding a safe place for her to go. It was about showing her that there were still people in the world who cared, that there was still hope, even after everything she had been through. He wasn't sure what the future held for her, but one thing was certain: she wasn't alone anymore. And that made all the difference. The officers continued to speak to the girl, but Tom could tell that she wasn't quite ready to fully trust them yet. There was still hesitation in her eyes, a wall she had built up after months, or even years, of whatever she had gone through. But as the minutes passed, something seemed to change. The girl's breathing slowed, and her grip on her baby softened just a little. It was a small shift, but it was enough to give Tom a sense of relief. At least she wasn't as tense as she had been. The officers weren't rushing her, which made all the difference. They weren't pushing her to speak or to explain everything. Instead, they gave her space, letting her take her time. Tom could see that the girl was still processing everything, but she wasn't alone anymore. She had help now, and that help was patient, understanding, and kind. The police officers spoke to each other briefly, one of them stepping out to make a call while the other stayed with the girl. Tom stood nearby, quietly watching the scene unfold. He knew that he couldn't be part of the conversation, not when the professionals were handling it, but he still felt a need to be there for her. He wasn't sure if the girl knew how much she had affected him, but he couldn't stop thinking about how she had appeared, so fragile and alone, just a short time ago. It wasn't long before the officer who had stepped out returned. She nodded to the other officer, and the two exchanged a few quiet words before turning their attention back to the girl. Tom felt the tension in the room ease just a little more as the officers began to make arrangements for the girl. The baby was still resting in her arms, and although it had stopped crying, it remained completely still, as if sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Tom couldn't help but smile softly at the baby. It was such a tiny thing, so vulnerable and dependent, yet somehow it seemed like the one constant in the girl's chaotic world. The girl still hadn't said much, but the officers had made sure to reassure her that she and her baby would be cared for. They explained that she would be taken to a hospital for a checkup, that a social worker would be assigned to her case, and that she didn't have to worry about being separated from her baby. Tom overheard some of this information, and it comforted him to hear that the girl's immediate needs were being taken seriously. But he also knew that it wouldn't be an easy road for her. She had a long journey ahead of her, one that would require time, healing, and support. He wasn't sure if she had any family, but if she didn't, there would be systems in place to help her, to make sure she didn't face this alone. As the officers prepared to take the girl to the hospital, Tom stepped forward. He wasn't sure if she would even notice him, but he felt compelled to say something. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. The girl looked at him for a moment, and he could see the faintest flicker of gratitude in her eyes. It wasn't much, but it was something. She nodded slightly, and though her face was still filled with uncertainty, there was a tiny spark of hope in her expression. It was a small moment, but it meant more than words could express. The officers helped the girl to her feet, and Tom instinctively stepped aside to give them room. One officer gently took the baby from her arms, and Tom couldn't help but notice how the girl hesitated, just for a second, before letting go. But the officer held the baby carefully, with the utmost care, and the girl seemed to settle. The moment was brief, but it was enough for Tom to see that there was still a glimmer of hope, of possibility for the future. The girl, with the baby safely in the arms of the officer, was escorted toward the door. Tom watched as they walked down the hall, his mind racing with thoughts of what might happen next. He hoped that, whatever came next, the girl would find the strength she needed to heal. It was clear to him that she was strong in her own way, even if she didn't realize it yet. As the door closed behind them, Tom stood in the quiet of the station, reflecting on the night's events. He had never imagined that a routine shift would turn into something like this. But as he stood there, he realized that this moment, the simple act of being there for someone in need, was what truly mattered. The world wasn't always easy, and people often faced challenges that were beyond their control. But for that girl, for that baby, the night had turned into something more. It was the beginning of a chance at safety, at care, and maybe even a chance at a new life. The hours after the girl and her baby had been taken to the hospital felt like they stretched on forever. Tom was still at the station, but his mind kept drifting back to the image of the girl sitting there in the bathroom, clutching her baby so tightly. He couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness that had filled him when he first saw her. But now, he knew she was in safe hands, and that thought brought him a sense of comfort. Still, he couldn't help but wonder about what would happen to her next. The morning was slowly creeping in, and the station was beginning to come back to life. The usual commuters started trickling in, their footsteps echoing through the station as they passed by. But none of them seemed to notice the quiet shift in the atmosphere, the subtle change that had taken place when the girl had been found. Tom stood behind the counter, mechanically going through his tasks, but his thoughts were still with her. What would her life look like now? Would she ever feel safe enough to trust again? Would she find peace? He glanced over at the clock, noting that it was almost time for the next round of reports to come in. But before he could focus on the paperwork, his phone rang. It was an unknown number, but something in his gut told him that it had to be about the girl. He answered quickly. "Hello." Tom's voice was a little shaky, but he tried to sound calm. "Hi, this is Officer Daniels. We just wanted to give you an update on the girl you helped last night." The voice on the other end was calm and professional, but there was something in it that made Tom's chest tighten with anticipation. "Is she okay?" Tom asked, unable to keep the worry out of his voice. "Yes, she's fine," Officer Daniels replied. "We've had her checked out at the hospital. Physically, she's healthy, and her baby is too. There are no immediate concerns." The officer paused for a moment, and Tom felt a sense of relief flood through him. But then the officer continued. "However, she's still pretty shaken up. She hasn't shared much about her situation yet, but we're working with social services to figure out the best way to help her." Tom nodded, even though the officer couldn't see him. "Do you think she'll be all right?" he asked quietly. "It's too soon to say," Officer Daniels answered gently. "She's been through a lot, and it will take time for her to open up. But we're going to make sure she's not alone in this. We have a safe place for her, and we'll make sure she gets the support she needs." Tom felt a weight lift from his shoulders, though it didn't completely disappear. He knew that the girl's road to recovery wouldn't be easy, but knowing that she was in good hands helped him feel better. He didn't have the answers, but he could rest a little easier knowing that the professionals were doing everything they could to help her heal. "Thank you for letting me know," Tom said, his voice soft. "You're welcome," Officer Daniels replied. "And just to let you know, we'll keep you updated on her case if you want. We appreciate your help, Tom. It wasn't easy, but you did the right thing." Tom hung up the phone slowly, taking a deep breath. He felt a mixture of emotions, relief, but also a lingering sadness. The girl was safe, but her journey had only just begun. He hoped that, over time, she would find the support she needed to move forward. He knew that some scars ran deep, but he also believed that people could heal. The station was starting to get busier now, but Tom couldn't shake the image of the girl from his mind. He went through the motions of his job, helping passengers with their tickets and answering questions, but his thoughts kept returning to her. She had been so young, so vulnerable. She had needed someone to see her, to help her, and he had been there for her. It was something he would never forget. As the day wore on, Tom's mind began to settle. He knew that the girl was in a better place, and that gave him some peace. He didn't know what the future held for her, but he hoped that one day she would find a sense of peace and safety. As he looked out over the bustling station, he realized that sometimes the smallest act of kindness could make all the difference. Helping someone, even in a small way, could change their life. And even though he couldn't undo what had happened to her, he had made sure that she wasn't alone anymore. That, he thought, was enough for now. Days passed, and life at the subway station slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Tom still worked his shifts, answering questions, assisting passengers, and keeping the station running smoothly. But something had changed within him. The memory of the young girl and her baby stayed with him, lingering in the back of his mind, a constant reminder of how fragile life could be. He had been part of something that had truly mattered, even if it was in a small way. The quiet hum of the trains, the constant shuffle of feet, and the occasional sound of someone running to catch their ride. It all felt the same. Yet, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that he had been a witness to something important, something bigger than the ordinary routines of everyday life. The girl's story wasn't over. She was still out there, working through her challenges, but at least she wasn't alone anymore. That thought gave him a sense of peace. One afternoon, a few weeks after that night, Tom was finishing up his shift when his phone buzzed. It was a message from the officer who had contacted him earlier. His heart skipped a beat as he opened it. The message was brief but powerful. "She wanted you to know she's doing better. She's starting to trust again. Thank you for being there when she needed someone. It made a difference." Tom stared at the words, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. The girl, the one who had seemed so lost, was starting to heal. He didn't know the full details of her recovery, but hearing that she was trusting again made him feel like he had done something important. It wasn't just about being there in that moment, in the bathroom. It was about offering a glimmer of hope, a sign that even in the darkest times, someone could care. The message also mentioned that she was still in a safe place, receiving support, and that the baby was thriving. He smiled at the thought of the baby, that tiny, fragile being who had started crying in the bathroom and now had a chance at a better life. It felt like a victory, even if it was only a small one. Tom closed his phone and leaned against the counter, lost in thought. He thought about the girl, how terrified she had been when he first found her, how her silence had spoken volumes about her pain. But now, with each passing day, she was finding her way out of the shadows. She had a chance at a new life, a chance to rebuild, and maybe even a chance to smile again someday. The reality of what had happened still weighed on him, but it didn't feel as heavy as it once had. The weight of the situation wasn't gone, but it had been lightened by the knowledge that she was safe and receiving help. It made him realize how much a single act of kindness could change the course of someone's life. A simple moment of reaching out, of seeing someone in need and offering support. Sometimes, that was all it took to make a difference. As the evening approached and the station became quieter again, Tom couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment. He had done his part. And though he wouldn't know the full details of the girl's recovery, he could take comfort in knowing that her journey was no longer one she had to face alone. There was still a long road ahead for her, but she was on her way. With a quiet sigh, Tom turned his attention back to the tasks at hand. The trains rumbled by, the commuters came and went, and life continued. But in his heart, Tom knew that the quiet act of helping a stranger in need had meant something much bigger than any routine shift could ever provide. And for that, he was grateful.